So I'm really excited to do this teaching. I'm going to be talking about David and how he was a man after God's own heart. And I think this is something that everybody should be able to relate to because I think it shows that anybody, no matter what state of life you're in, no matter who you are or where you come from, that God can use you and your story and your life as a way to bring him glory. And I'll try to go through that and talk about 6 different points that I believe makes David a man after God's own heart. And so the first thing I wanted to talk about was how David was overlooked. And I think that's such an important thing to talk about because I know that I felt that way and many of you may have felt that way as well, that you feel like you're overlooked or unimportant even in your family, which is the very same thing that David experienced. David was one of 8 sons. He was the youngest. And David was sort of put in the field to take care of the sheep and the animals while his brothers were given the, quote unquote, important task of going out to do important work like fighting in wars and things like that. And so when Samuel is sent to the house of Jesse to anoint one of Jesse's sons, Jesse doesn't even bring David in to be considered to be anointed. He leaves him out because he doesn't think he's important enough because he's just a shepherd, unlike his other brothers who are not. And so when Samuel is before them, God clearly tells Samuel, I am not picking any of these 7 sons. And so that's when Samuel asks Jesse, do you have another son? And at that point, that's when Jesse brings David in. And even though David, his appearance is described as being, ruddy, he has these beautiful eyes, he's a handsome young man, it's not his appearance that appeals to God, it's his heart. And so in 1 Samuel 16:7, God says, for the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. So I think that's a very comforting fact, understanding that God is not interested in your circumstances or the outward appearance of things. He's interested in your heart. And I hope that you all see that as I continue to go through these points. Point number 2 is that David used what he had. And I know that sounds very strange, but I think sometimes a lot of us feel like because we don't have certain things, like we don't have the right money or the right job or the right degree, we don't come from the right family or the right neighborhood, we don't have the right connections, we feel like we can't do what God is calling us to do. And I think God makes it very clear that whatever it is that you have right now, you can already start and you can already begin. And I think that's something that you see in the story with David and Goliath. So before David goes out into the field to fight Goliath, Saul tries to put him in his armor. And then David puts it on and he says, I can't wear this because I haven't tested it, because this armor is made to fit Saul. It's not made to fit David. And so what works for Saul is not going to work for David, just like what works for someone else is not going to work for you. What works for someone else is not going to work for me. God has equipped us and given us separate gifts and different talents that benefit us and allow us to carry on the name of God to also benefit others. And so not only did David not put on the armor, but he takes what he's used to, which is a slingshot and a stone, which may seem ridiculous because that was not something that they used to fight wars. They would usually use swords or arrows or something like that. And so the interesting thing is that not only did David understand that this is my weapon, this is what God is going to use to bring victory, he also understood that it was God who was backing him. It wasn't just him out on the field alone with his slingshot and his stones. It was God who was backing him. And so David approaches Goliath with this slingshot and this stone, and he says, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. And I think that is also encouraging, the idea that God can take whatever it is that you've used, just like God took this young shepherd boy who had a slingshot and stones who he would use to fight against lions and bears and not actual people. And he used that skill set to create victory, just like God can use our situations and what we're used to and our gifts to create victory. And so going to my third point, I wanted to bring up how David won people over with humility and righteousness, which is a very difficult thing to do, but it's not impossible. Even for people who are mature in Christ, it can be difficult to be humble sometimes or to operate in righteousness. But this was something that David had a natural skill set for, and he did this with multiple people. He did this with Jonathan, who was the son of Saul. He did this with his own men, but he also did it with King Saul himself, and that's the one that I wanted to focus on because David had been fleeing for a long time from Saul because Saul was trying to pursue him to kill him. And there was a point in time where David goes to the cave of En-Gedi where Saul is. And so Saul is inside this cave and David confronts him about wanting to kill him. And so he comes out and he says, who have you come out to kill? You've come to kill a dead dog and a flea. He was like, I don't matter, like I'm not important. And so David is humbling himself in the presence of someone who he has created no offense in and has no reason to be killed by him. And yet instead of arguing with him, he's saying, I'm a dead dog and I'm a flea, I'm nobody, and you're coming out to kill no one. And not only does he say that, but then David also says that I'm not gonna take revenge against you. I'm gonna let God judge between you and I. And so when Saul hears this, his attitude completely changes and he says, you are more righteous than I am. And not only does he say that, but he's like, I'm completely confident that you are going to be king, that God is going to deliver the kingdom of Israel into your hands because you are more righteous than me. And after that, Saul ceases stop trying to kill him. And I think that's like an amazing thing. And it's a hard thing to do, but it is very, very possible. And I think it's interesting to see how we can encourage others to be righteous. Like our salvation cannot create salvation in others necessarily, but it can encourage other people to make more righteous decisions, especially when we're humbling ourselves before people who profess to be our enemies. And so the fourth point I want to bring up is that David was really good at keeping his word. And that was something that God would often do, often encourage the Israelites about in the word of God, is that I keep my promises. And that is something that God even wants us to know today, that he still keeps his promises. And there was a promise that David made to Jonathan before he became king. And he promises Jonathan that I'm not going to harm you or anybody else in your household, because David was going to rise to be a king. He was going to overthrow Saul. He was going to take the throne away from Jonathan. But instead of creating Jonathan as an enemy, he's like, I'm not going to treat you or your descendants as an enemy. I'm going to love your household. And so Jonathan ends up passing away. And so Jonathan is not alive to keep this promise between him and David. It's David's responsibility to do it, even though Jonathan has passed away. And so David is extremely intentional about keeping this promise, because even though Jonathan and his father had passed away, David is asking his men, his people in his court, like, is there anybody in the house of Saul that I can show kindness to for the sake of Jonathan? And so they go out and they find Jonathan's son Mephibosheth, and they bring him to David. And David not only gives him the freedom to eat at his table for the rest of his life, but he also takes everything from the house of Saul and gives it to Jonathan's son Mephibosheth instead of keeping it for himself. And so he's being intentional about keeping this promise, even though there's no one there alive to be a witness to him doing this. He does it because he knows it's the right thing to do. And it reminds me of Psalm 15, 1 and 4, when it says, O Lord, who shall sojourn in your tent? Who shall dwell on your holy hill? And then verse 4 says, who swears to his own hurt and does not change. So those are the kind of people that God wants to be in his tent and dwell on his hill. People who make these promises and they keep them, even if it causes you some level of pain or discomfort, that I'm keeping my promise because my word is more important than my own personal comfort. It's something that elevates the reputation of who I am when I keep my promises. And so the fifth thing I want to talk about is David, how he handled correction and discipline as well. Because even though I'm talking about David being a man after God's own heart, we all know that David made mistakes, just like we all make mistakes. But even in the midst of those mistakes, David was still acting as a man of God, because there's one particular mistake that people don't really give as much attention to. People tend to gravitate towards the David and Bathsheba story, but I do want to talk about the mistake that David made with the census. So David takes a census because he's enticed by Satan to do so. And so he does it and he falls into that temptation. And so Satan entices him to do this. And so God decides that I'm going to punish not just David, but the entire nation of Israel. And so he makes David choose between three different punishments. He has to choose between either 3 years of famine, 3 months of fleeing from enemies, or 3 days of pestilence. And so he chooses pestilence, but the interesting thing is that he chooses it because he says, let us fall into the hand of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but let me not fall into the hand of man. So even though David has made this mistake, even though he knows that he's being punished and the nation of Israel is being punished because of his own mistake, he doesn't get angry with God. He says, God is still merciful, and that's why I'm picking this punishment, because I understand the mercy of God. And I think that's a very difficult thing for even us as human beings, even in this time period, to understand that even when we make mistakes, even when we're being punished for our mistakes, whether we felt like it was justified or not, that God is still merciful. We don't become angry with God. And even if we do, that's okay. But it's the idea that David in this moment was like, I understand that the mercy of God is still here, even in the midst of this punishment. And he handled that so well. So God ends up being merciful at the end of that. And so the last thing that I want to talk about, and this is point number 6, is that David recognized and took opportunities. And that may seem like a simple thing, but I think I've experienced this, just like some of you may have, is that sometimes taking opportunities involves taking risk, and your fear can stop you from doing that. And I admire how David didn't really stop himself from taking opportunities out of situations that could have created fear. So for example, going back to the story of David and Goliath, there was no indication that David was supposed to be the one to go out there. God doesn't tell David, go out and fight Goliath. He doesn't get prompted to do so by somebody else, whether it's his brothers or even Saul. His elder brother Eliab actually tries to convince him not to do it because he thinks he's being arrogant by choosing to do so. And even the idea that David was there on the battlefield that day because he wasn't supposed to be fighting. He was supposed to be delivering food to his brothers and to the commander of the army. So he was only supposed to be there to deliver food and then leave. That was his job there. But he shows up there and he hears King Saul give the command that if anybody defeats Goliath, they will receive the reward of marrying my daughter, and they will receive the reward of their household never having to pay taxes again. And so David hears that, and he's like, I'm going to take that opportunity. I'm going to be the one to do that. And this was a young shepherd boy who spent his days fighting against lions and bears, not against people like Goliath. And so he doesn't have a lot of military experience, and yet he stepped up to the plate and he took that risk, and he won that battle, and he was immediately a military king, in a way. And not only that, but then David also takes another great opportunity, which I admire, where later on in his story in the book of 2 Samuel, there's a moment where David and his men are coming back from the camp of the Philistines after they defeat the Philistines. They're bringing back the ark of God that was stolen away. And then one of the animals that's carrying the ark stumbles, and one of the men catches it to stop it from falling. And because they touch this holy ark, then they are struck down and they're killed by God himself. And so David becomes afraid, and he decides to leave this ark with this man named Obed-Edom. And so because the Ark of the Covenant is there, his household is blessed. Obed-Edom is blessed. Everything in his household, his family is blessed. And so David hears about this, and he's like, I have to go back and get this ark, because even though he was afraid to take it back with him because of the death that occurred to one of his men in his camp, he's like, I have to bring this back because we need Israel to be blessed. My household has to be blessed, and so does the entire nation of Israel. And so when he goes back to get it, he was stepping out of his fear, because 2 Timothy 1:7 says, for the Spirit God gives us does not make us timid, but gives us power, love, and self-discipline. So it's the idea that he had to push past that fear and go get something that was going to bless the entire nation of Israel. And so going back over those points really quickly, like David was overlooked. David used what he had. David won people over with humility and righteousness. David kept his word. David handled correction and discipline well, and he recognized and took opportunities. And so those things are things that anybody can do. It's not something that only David can do. It's not something that only I can do, that you all can do it as well. And I hope that you all see that. And I thank you all so much for listening.